You'll instantly know if that's something you like. Who cares what the research says? If you dig it, keep doing it. You try cold plunge and you think it's stupid, don't do it. Who cares what Wim Hof says? All right, pretend you and I are going on an adventure, and the adventure is not what you would expect me to say. We're going to a 2-year-old's birthday party. You and I, we show up to the house. It's decorated wonderfully, and there's a 2-year-old there. Now, even though you and I aren't really going to this, I know that you know exactly what's about to happen at this party. At some point, because of the overzealous parents, this 2-year-old is going to start crying, right? This 2-year-old is going to start crying. It's inevitable. I would venture to say it's happened at every 2-year-old birthday party. And at that moment, we look at each other, and the parents look at each other, and all the parents look at one another, and we say, this 2-year-old needs a nap. And in our all-knowing wisdom, we realize that this kid needs a nap, not because something is wrong. This kid doesn't need a nap because we did anything wrong, but it needs a nap because this kid needs to process what's just happened to him. This kid needs to digest all of the experiences that just went down, and we readily accept that. We accept it because we say that this kid has been overstimulated. I remember hearing stories from my mom, my wonderful mother, of being overstimulated myself. But we fast forward and say, we leave the 2-year-old birthday party and we're transported into our own lives. We're no longer the 2-year-olds. We're fully functioning adults. And we tell ourselves, and I'm just going to use my life as an example. I've read Peter Attia's book, Health Span, and he recommends that I need 4 hours a week of Zone 2 work, plus 4 hours a week of strength training. I need 2 additional hours to stretch. Andrew Huberman tells me that I need to cold plunge and get in the sauna every single day. That's a 30-minute increment. I also need to be cooking all of my own food, and I want to make sure that there's nothing processed in my diet. We know that I need to meditate for at least an hour if it's going to be worth anything, and I need to go through breath work recommended through Wim Hof. As well, I need to sleep 9 hours. Now, from there, from a work standpoint, I need to create a multi-million-dollar business. I need thousands of followers. I need to be producing content on 4 different platforms every single day. I need to increase or decrease, rather, our response time, increase our touch points with our customers, and then I transition home, and I need to be a present and attentive father. I need to romance my wife every day if I want to be any type of a good husband. I need to be a good brother. I need to listen to the 6 hours of podcasts that I've been recommended. I need to read the 4 books that are essential for me to do my job across these 3 platforms, and I need to journal. How do we go from assuming that it's okay for us to be overstimulated to say that there's nothing we can do that's enough? When did this become normal? When did we tell ourselves that we don't need any margin? When did we say that these protocols were acceptable? Is because we tell ourselves we had this fully functioning brain that we're capable of this? Do you think that you're that much different than a 2-year-old? I'm Spencer Nix. This is the Behavior and Performance Research podcast, where we delve into the art of radical health and athlete design. And today, we're going to be speaking and leaving with some practical tools around anxiety, around stress management. Now, one of my favorite movies is Point Break. My dog is named Bodie after Patrick Swayze's character. That's how much I love this movie, and I don't need any comments on if this is an Academy Award winning field. Okay, back off, War Child. But my favorite line in the movie is Swayze and Johnny Utah. Keanu Reeves are walking from a surf session, and he's talking about these characters in the movie, and he says they only live to get radical. And I love that because if you know what the etymology of radical means, it doesn't mean probably what Swayze's saying, that they're trying to be punks or extreme, but radical is a return to the roots. So as we dig into this today, a lot of what I say is going to be contrarian. It's going to be radical. We have this great analytical service on the back end of YouTube and some of the other places that we're putting the podcast, and it will give us recommendations. One of the recommendations is this topic right here, but what it goes into great detail on what it says to do is
Make sure, ensure that you're sharing breathing techniques and meditation practices. The thumbnail should include picture of you in lotus position.
and we're not gonna do any of that. And it's not that that stuff isn't great. Okay, so I'm not pooping on meditation. I just assume that you already know that. I don't talk to anybody that doesn't conceptually and intellectually recognize that meditation is a good thought. I also don't know a single person that meditates every day. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know them. And I think for most of us, it's a pipe dream. And so what I'd like to do is wade through a lot of these things that I think are band-aids. It would be the equivalent, in a cute little analogy, is putting all of these little plugs and holes that keep popping up in our boat. And maybe a better question is, hey, how do we keep the hull of our vessel from being cracked in the first place? So we need to get to the root cause of why this is such a pernicious and insidious problem. Because I think if there's one thing that, as working adults, we probably could all have a support group for, it's feeling anxious at times. So a great place to start, as I always think, is to talk a little bit about the why, to understand a little bit about the causal mechanisms of this, because without that, you won't have a heads up of why this is happening, where to look for it, manifestations or responses to this thing that's going on internally. And when we say anxiety, I'm going to give you the street version instead of something that sounds really, really complicated or really intellectual. Our brain has a great functioning to let us know when there might be trouble. This process of our brain, as to quote the great Alan Watts, is a good servant, but it's a bad monster. So like many things, this is a function that has, in centuries past, saved our lives. Even to this day, we don't want this to go away. We don't want this ability to assess threats to disappear. So it's much like from a biological perspective, like the mechanisms of insulin. Insulin's been vilified because of type 2 diabetes, but we die without the mechanisms of insulin and glucagon. I digress. Anxiety is a good thing. Anxiety is a normal thing. But for most of us, we're not dealing with a normal function. We're dealing with an overproduction. We're lightly treading into this place of vigilance, this place of being on constant alert, and this constant low-grade, low-level stress response that's, for some of us, making our life harder than it needs to be. Now, because this is a podcast for coaches, I'll shift back and forth between ways that if you're in a role of guidance, it would be helpful to be aware. But I think this is great information just for us as human beings. Some of the things that that we need to think about is like the meta level of this, thinking about your thinking. Excuse me, some of the ways that we can assess if this is an issue for us are by one of four criterias. Number one is rumination. It means that you're excessively thinking about something. A good way that that shows up is instead of planning something and having kind of a very cursory level understanding of what it is you need to get into, you tell yourself that you need to have every single detail pinned down. And I mean all of them. And you go over these details again and again and again to no avail. It's not really getting you anywhere. Dwight Eisenhower said that plans are kind of stupid. That's not actually what he said, but that's my version of the quote. Plans are dumb, but planning is essential. And that's a great way to gauge where you're at on that spectrum. It's absolutely necessary to plan. That's a good thing. When you are obsessing about the details to the nth degree, it's this great indication like, hey, I might be overdoing this. Secondly, you may find that you have trouble deciding something. You're presented with a lot of options. And what I personally struggle with is this feeling of overwhelm, not because I don't know what to come up with, but because I've come up with too much. I have too many options in front of me. And I hate this word, but I get overwhelmed because I don't know which one to do. So it's an indecision. Next is just a complete avoidance. There are things that you're actually not addressing. Now, this can show up physically. We could see this by you not even showing up at the thing that you needed to show up at. More times than not, it's an avoidance of even thinking about the thing that you need to think about. Maybe this is finances. You know what? I don't even want to sit down and balance my checkbook because I don't want to see that I don't have enough money in there to actually budget well. Lastly, and I'm sure there's more criteria than this, but it's just a nice way to simplify it. It's not just avoidance, but you're in the activity and you just got to bail. You got to release the emergency handle and you're out of there. You can see all these in yourself in ways that like you're at something and all of a sudden it's like, I gotta get out of here. But you can also see it in others because we're talking about fitness and we're talking about health. These behaviors can manifest in your own clients. You present a plan and they need to circle back to it 20 or 30 times to get even more granular. Red flag. You give them very simple options and they have a hard time deciding. They will not show up for training. Or, and I've seen this not very often, but it does happen, someone shows up to the gym and they bail mid-session. When you see these things, it doesn't mean that you need to call 911. It doesn't even mean necessarily that there's this pathological problem that you need to outsource, but it's asking good questions. That's a great place to start. I think that as we get into the specific protocols, a good coach isn't an okay coach is giving lots of options. They're educating. A great coach is a filter. A great coach is telling the client when to do something. And so that really is a huge thing to anchor ourselves to hinge off of as we get into some of these protocols, is that nothing I'm about to say is good or bad, but it's just figuring out like when. It's figuring out what makes the most sense for you. And I always find that part of the message is missing when I hear these things that we're about to launch into. And there is some irony that I'm giving you a podcast on how not to be overstimulated, and I potentially am giving you something that is going to be in that category. But nonetheless, it comes down to some trial and error, and it comes down to figuring out what works for you. Don't forget that. So I tried to get really cute with these protocols, and they're 3 R's. I was going to try to repurpose like reduce, reuse, and recycle, but it didn't work. But I did come up with this. Are you ready? It's reduce, it's reflect, and it's restore. That's good, huh? Reduce, reflect, and restore. So when we're talking about stress management, when we're talking about anxiety, there's a strong argument that anxiety is a product of overstimulation, just like the story of the 2-year-old's birthday party. Now, when you are faced with overstimulation, when you're faced with, as we mentioned earlier, a plethora, good word, right? A plethora of options, you need to get as strategic as possible. It means that the potential for information is almost infinite. This fear of missing out isn't about being in physical places. At this point in time, fear of missing out is fear of missing out on information, because there is a podcast being released every single day. There is a book coming out every single day by experts with information that you think, man, if I read that, maybe it could finally make me smart enough to have a good life. But if that's the route that you go down, it's going to be impossible to consume all the things that you think you need to consume. And so you have to reduce it down to the essentials. I can only give examples of myself because I'm the only one here. I can't give that for you, but I don't watch any news. I don't know anything that's going on. I don't watch any sports. It's not because I couldn't benefit from some of the information that I would get from the news. And it's not because I don't like sports. I find it very cathartic and very relaxing to watch a football game. But I don't do it. I don't do it because I don't think it's the best use of my time compared to other things that I could be doing. Maybe you need to shut this podcast off, right? Maybe all of those recommendations that you've been given of things to listen to, maybe you don't need to listen to them. And it's not to say that it's not good information, but just like we said earlier, you need to decide when is the right time to do that. Nothing's bad, but the best way to say this is that you need to find what activities provide the most leverage for yourself. I love Huberman, as I'm sure you do. I love Peter T. I think he's such a smart guy, but when you add up all of the recommendations that they've made, it's literally impossible to do them all. You would have to quit your job and become a professional exerciser, a professional wellness person in order to do all these things. And so you got to realize that the amount of protocols that are being asked of you is in excess of what you're capable of doing. And so you just got to pick. Now, the meta analysis of this is that by picking which things are going to make you less anxious, that also could make you anxious. And so as you go about this, man, give yourself some grace. Realize that you're not going to nail it the first time. Try sauna. You'll instantly know if that's something you like. Who cares what the research says? If you dig it, keep doing it. You try a cold plunge and you think it's stupid, don't do it. Who cares what Wim Hof says? You're going to have to figure out what works for you. Now, secondly, and this is the contrarian opinion that I have, you want to figure out what is really important to you. That's what you'll keep doing. But you also need to become bad at a bunch of stuff. You need to be terrible at several things. The genius of my own father, he didn't have much, but one of the smartest things that he ever did is that he burned the barbecue every time he cooked it. He wanted us to know, I think, now we've never been able to prove this, he wanted us to know that he was terrible at this. And now I have 4 little brothers. Guess what happens? My dad never cooks the barbecue. We have relieved him of that obligation, of that responsibility, because we told ourselves that he's not very good at it. Now, it turns out I've seen him cook in other scenarios, and he's actually a great chef. I think he did that either subconsciously or consciously on purpose, so he didn't have to do it anymore. There's probably lots of things that you're really good at right now that aren't doing anything to move the plot of your life forward. Email. Years ago, I realized that I was keeping my inbox at a 0. Someone sent me an email, and I would respond instantaneously. And that felt good to be good at that, but I realized that I didn't care about that. And also, if my response time was really good, people were going to send me more emails because they knew that I would be the one that would take care of that. You fast forward to today, And I think my inbox has 30,000 emails or something like that. And that may, to someone, produce stress. But for me, it relieved it because I realized that the worse I got at email, the less people would rely on me to solve their problems through that medium. It's turning into text for me as well. We send a text and we think, man, this person needs to respond instantaneously, but maybe there's some wiggle room there as well. I'm not very good at small talk. I don't want to be good at small talk. I would like to be bad at small talk so I don't have to do it as much. I'm not very good at parties. I don't want to be good at parties. I don't enjoy them. I don't find that medium or that amount of people is something that I even want to be good at. And so there's things in my life that I've decided I want to be bad at this, because the things that you're good at are the things that you're spending a lot of time doing. And so the things that you want to spend a lot of time doing, they better be things that are worth it to you. Because I imagine at the end of your life, you're not going to sit there on your deathbed and say, man, I nailed it when it came to email. Boy, talking about the weather and traffic, no one was better than I was. So just pick the things that you want to be good at, pick the things you want to be bad at. All right, that's reduce. Now, the second part, and I think this is way more interesting than what I just said, but the second part, this reflect, is what I think is missing for most people. Anxiety, I believe, is this smokescreen for what's really going on. Anxiety is almost masking the things in our life that we're really struggling with. Now, as coaches, or even to yourself, this is the question that you would ask to determine that. And you would say like this: if your mind wasn't fixed with these particular anxious thoughts, if your mind wasn't filled with these particular anxious thoughts, what might you have to think about? And the answer to that question, if we're honest with ourselves, can provide some original insight. The answer to that question may be, hey, without these anxious thoughts, I feel bad and I feel lonely. I feel angry about fill in the blank. I feel abandoned because of, if that's you, that's tough business. I would argue it's way tougher than being constantly stimulated with whatever it is that you're doing, or ruminating over something, or having this brain that doesn't shut off. The step of that is not easy, but it is obvious. The step for that is to just process it. To think, hey, if I wasn't thinking these anxious thoughts, why would I not deal with this? And then just do your best to try and deal with it. Anxiety is trying to keep those bigger, dare we say, like existential questions at bay. And so if that's true, and I absolutely believe that it is, what do you do with that? The hardest thing that I'll say on here, but it's no less true, is allowing yourself time to sift through that. I think if we were to dumb this down to mathematics, a great rule of thumb is that for every hour of living, you need 10 minutes of sifting. That means that if you're, awake for 15 hours, that's 2.5 hours of thinking about your thinking, or sifting through what's going on with you. And I know what just popped into your head. It's like, hey, you just told me to not overstimulate myself. So you're advocating that I need to do something for 2.5 hours. And the answer is yes, but also no. Because one, you got to realize that this isn't avoidance. This is way harder than scrolling through Instagram for that same amount of time. This is way harder than constantly being engaged in something at work. This is time where you're not doing anything. I'm not telling you that you need to go through some questioning protocol necessarily. I'm telling you that when you get in the car and you transition back and forth between the things throughout your day, which is probably on average about 10 to 15 minutes, and you do it 4 times, you're going to throw your phone in the back seat. You want to hear something radical? Instead of at a stoplight, you scrolling through your phone, at a stoplight, you stare out the windshield. You got a day trip where you got to go down to Austin, you're not going to listen to any music. You're just going to sit and think. That's radical. That's hard. Nobody's saying that's easy. But if you'll add up the time throughout your day where you don't want to be alone with those thoughts, and your compensation is to do something busy or to be distracted, you'll find out that a couple of hours a day is readily available to you. Not in one huge spurt, but in these little chunks of transition, I like to call them. For the last several years, and there was a book I read that I think recommended this, Brendon Burchard's High Performance Habits or something like that. Something that stuck out to me is like a triathlete going from swim to bike to run. These things don't happen instantaneously. There's transitions between each one. And I think this transition is a really low-hanging fruit to not create more stimulation, but to create some boredom. I mean, I think that's a big reason why we do what it is we do. We don't want to be bored. Why do we not want to be bored? Because we don't want to be alone with our thoughts. But just giving yourself permission to think about something, that may be unpleasant, is counterintuitive, but it's a step in the right direction of getting radical. Now, from there, we may need a little bit more direction. Sometimes, and the reason that, there's specific protocols for meditation, sometimes the reason that those protocols exist because without them, our brain's just like dancing around to, whatever is happening. We look at the windshield and we don't think of anything. We're just kind of reacting to whatever's going on outside of our body. If that's the case for you, there are a few questions. So instead of just this free form, journaling, which we've talked about in previous episodes, dear diary, and you just kind of write whatever, comes to mind, you could ask yourself these three questions. What is making me feel anxious right now? And if you want to use a different word, just say, hey, what do I feel overwhelmed with at this moment? The answer to that question is probably going back to the previous step of figuring out like, hey, what do I need to reduce? What do I need to figure out is going to be the most strategic decision for me and my time? A second question is, what's caused me pain and how? The answer to that question is usually readily available. I've found in asking it to other people. And then whatever the answer to that is, you try to process it. If there's someone that's responsible for that, as we said in previous episodes, you need to formulate how you can communicate that without any emotional charge, without any value judgment, and just communicate the facts. And then lastly, and this is kind of the other side of the coin, a lot of anxiousness, a lot of feeling overwhelmed doesn't come from shitty things in your life. It can come from being excited. It can come from having all of these awesome opportunities at your disposal. And so asking the question, what is exciting me, is a great way to get to the deeper level of some of the things that you're feeling. Lastly, about meditation, I don't do great in that crisscross applesauce position with my hands in this position, staring at the wall and going day, da. I don't do great there, and I don't think there's anything wrong with me as far as it comes to that. But I tell you what I do great with, and I bet you would too, is something that's just active enough where you can let your brain go where it wants to. It's not complete zero, right? You're doing something, but it's not so engaging that you have to be totally focused on that activity. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which is the guy that coined the phrase flow, calls this an autotelic experience. That's a really fancy word to say that you're doing the thing just for the sake of doing it by itself. I think that's where walking is awesome. And I know what you're thinking. Okay, if it's walking, I gotta put on a weight vest, and I gotta turn this into a ruck, and I gotta time this, and I gotta. There's nothing here that needs to be quantified. the most free person on the earth? It's somebody that's taken a stroll, not a power walk, not where you're looking at your heart rate, a stroll. That's one of the most luxurious things that's out there. Charles Darwin was famous for taking these walks, not that were strenuous, but they were just like slow enough where he could differentiate the blades of the grass, and he could tell the difference in bugs on the trees. And I think just that act alone, forget everything I've said. That one thing, it's not sophisticated. It's blue collar. There's nothing white collar about going for walks. But I bet that one thing could do you wonders in filling up this space between stimulation and total downregulation in a way that you could reflect. And look, some of the greatest epiphanies I've had is riding a skateboard, riding a bike. Who knows what that is for you? But I think this thing we're talking about is a big category that could check a lot of these boxes in ways that we could process and sift through all these things that are happening to us. And last but not least is restore. What we're physiologically capable of doing, what's physiologically possible, may not be psychologically probable. That means what we can physically ask ourselves to do is clearly not psychologically in our best interest. Another way to say this is there needs to be margin in your life. And that has a little to do with sifting. That has a little to do with the ability to reflect. But I think specifically, there's two basic things that we overlook. And when I say them, you're going to think it's so dumb and so easy. And if it is, that's great. That means that you can do it without having to put it on your vision board. You can do this without having to even write this down. At some point, the hacks in your life have to stop, and you just need to go to sleep. Maybe, just maybe, you don't need to get divorced. You don't need to change careers. You don't need to change religions. You don't need to move to a new country. Maybe you just need to go to sleep. I wonder how many of our problems, even this overstimulation and overprotective mechanism of our brain, if we just got 9 hours of sleep and decrease the expectations we had for ourselves during the day, I wonder if that would do the trick. Secondly, and gosh darn it, I know this is something that you do even as you're watching this video and you think, do I really need coaching here? But I think that you do. And it is breath. Now, typically when I hear something about the breath, it makes me roll my eyes. It's like they're trying to take this thing that we're doing anyways and make it crunchy, make it granola, make it a little woo-woo. And I've never in my life had any success with a dedicated breath work practice where I'm sitting for several minutes on end and for a long time, like trying to think about my breath. But it's no less important. And I think a better strategy is instead of, once again, and here's like a constant theme, instead of these big allocated chunks where it's like, okay, I'm going to spend an hour really, focusing on my breath. It's being constantly attuned to what's happening with you. This feeling of overwhelm, this feeling of anxiousness, it has a physiological feeling. It feels like the breath is trapped in your chest. That's a sympathetic nervous response. Now, for most of us, it isn't so significant that it means we're about to like fight, or we're about to flee, or we're about to freeze. But once again, it's like this low level. But even at that lower level, you can feel it. You can feel when you're breathing through your chest. And my recommendation is that every time that you feel that, you don't need to stop and turn on the Calm app. You don't need to go into a meditative state. But you ready for this? You just need to take a deep breath. You need to slow your rate of speech down. You need to do something right then in the moment that makes you feel parasympathetic. It tells yourself, I'm good. I'm okay. Because I don't know about you, but most of the anxiousness I feel is around control. It's around tough conversations with people. And when I take a deep breath, when I tell myself I'm okay, it sounds dumb, but in the moment, it actually does wonders. This has been so powerful that I do it as a transition into and out of every single thing that I do all day long. Did you hear that? It's not something that I'm allocating an hour for. It means that when I go into a tough conversation, I take a deep breath and I slow my speech down. I'm having a lot of sessions with people that are talking about really stressful things. I've found that it doesn't help for me to bond over their trauma. What do? I have to take a deep breath and I have to slow my speech down. And what's crazy is as I do that, it makes me feel a lot better. Not only does it make me feel better, it makes me like a better dad when my kids make me want to punch them. And it makes me a better husband when my wife says something unexpectedly that, triggers something that upset me from childhood. And it's a great way to transition from being at work while I'm in the car before I open the door. Every day before I open the door to go home, I do this. Before I touch the door handle, I take a big breath. And I ask myself, this is off the reservation of anxiety, but I ask myself, what would it look like for a world-class dad to show up here? I ask myself, do you think your kids give a shit if you had a hard day at work? And the answer is no. I do that before I coach in the morning. I got all this stuff going through my brain, but before the first person comes in the door, I take a deep breath and I say, you think anybody cares if you had a hard weekend? This reframing, this shifting, this down regulation, this parasympathetic response is something that is easy, it's simple, and if that's true, then you should do it. In close, it might be awesome to be famous and have thousands of followers and to be rich and to have all of this wealth so I can go do all the things that I want to do. But maybe, just maybe, something that's greater than achievement would be to stay sane all the years of my life and to be able to be kind all the time to those that I love, which, if you really think about it, should be everybody that you come in contact with. Now, by saying that, it doesn't mean that we're backing away from doing hard things. Isn't that popular, right? Isn't that what's everywhere? It's like, God, you're going to go do hard things. Look at how far I ran. Look at what I'm doing out there. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. But the reason that's so popular is it's easy to signal. It's really cool to get on social media and be like, look at this workout I did. Look, go do hard things. But maybe it's just shifting our sense of what really hard is. You with me on that? Maybe this thing we're talking about is just as hard as going and banging out a high-intensity workout. Or maybe this thing of simplifying our life is even harder than filling our life with all of these activities that we can brag about. You know what I think the most alpha male thing to do is to be able to have these conversations with yourself and to be able to prioritize not being a tough guy, but being kind and psychologically sane and not telling a single person about it. That to me is probably the most alpha thing that you can do, but I digress. All of these things that I'm saying are harder because they're not cool. Nothing I've said here is anything you want to brag about. I mean, maybe being bad at something, that's kind of fun to brag about. But besides that, you can't post about this stuff. Nobody's going to read a post about me going to sleep. Nobody's going to read a post about me taking a deep breath before I grab the door handle. Nobody's going to read a post about me digging into my past hangups and why I'm so angry. But maybe that's all the more reason to get radical.